Good evening. My name is Sherry Mizumori, and I'm professor and chair of the psychology department, which brings you this evening's lecture tonight. I really have the distinct honor of welcoming you here for the 2015 annual Edwards Public Lecture Series. And I'm pleased that you can join the psychology department as we celebrate one of our research specialties, the psychological science of inequity and inequality. Now, before introducing the evening lectures, I'd like to just make a few comments about how this series came about. Now, this truly exciting annual lecture series is the result of a generous gift from one of our former professors, Professor Alan Edwards. And he made a substantial gift to establish an endowment that ensures that lecture series like this continues annually and for really into perpetuity. So Professor Edwards was affiliated with our department for about half a century. He came here in 1944, and he remained here as a professor until his death in 1994. And he was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer who's credited with changing the way that modern psychological research is conducted. In fact, he introduced modern statistical methods to this field, and to this day, a lot of his books remain the gold standard in these introductory psychology statistics courses. Now, the Edwards family contribution to the psychology department really is an example of what can be accomplished with support from members of the community, such as yourselves, and each one of you in this room. Now, especially I know we've had some tough economic times, and I just want to say that your support has been very much appreciated and has been critical to our continued success in the department. And again, I just want to thank many of you who I know are continuing contributors to our department. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Now, it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Professor Anthony Greenwald as our first speaker this evening. Dr. Greenwald received his AB degree from Yale College, and then his AM and PhD degrees from Harvard University. Then in 1965, Dr. Greenwald joined the psychology department at Ohio State University, where he rose through the ranks from assistant professor to full professor in that psychology department. In 1986, we were fortunate enough to recruit him here to the University of Washington, where he has remained ever since. Now, Dr. Greenwald is truly a pioneer in the general field of social psychology, and in particular, he's a world leader in research on attitudes, beliefs, culture, ethnicity, and social cognition. And as you'll hear tonight, much of his work deals with this notion of implicit biases and implicit associations. That is, these are associations that one makes without your knowledge that you're even making these associations. You'll hear more about this work again tonight. Now, Dr. Greenwald's research has been recognized around the world. He's received a long list of awards, such as the Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology and the Donald Campbell Award from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology. He's been elected as fellow or member status to the most prestigious of scientific organizations, such as the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and the Association for Psychological Sciences, and the American Psychological Association. Dr. Greenwald has also served on numerous editorial boards. Thus, his impact on the whole field of psychology has been quite significant, and it's really my honor to introduce Dr. Greenwald tonight.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you all for coming. And I want to join Sherry in thanking Alan Edwards personally, who I had the pleasure of overlapping with in the first several years. I was on the faculty here, and whose generous endowment and the support by his family has made this series possible, and many other good things in the psychology department. Here's the title of my talk: Discriminating Without Awareness of Discriminating, something that I would like to say we are all capable of doing. I'll give you the roadmap right now where I'm heading, and I'll remind you, or remind myself of where I'm heading several times during this, so I stay on path. Many people engage in discrimination without any intent to discriminate, without any awareness that they are discriminating. I am one of those people. very likely you too are one of those people. It's very difficult to prevent the unintended discrimination that I'm talking about. There are nevertheless things that one can do. And that's where it's one of the more important topics that I am just beginning to get to after working on this line of research for close to 20, 25 years. Some background. What I'm going to talk about today fits into the context of two revolutions. One is a societal revolution that I date as starting in the middle of the 20th century. It's a revolution involving discrimination in America and many other places. I've got a blue rectangle around the word discrimination to remind myself that I want to define that for you, because I'm using the term in a way that may not be the way you most readily or spontaneously use it. And I am using it in the way it's used in the law. It talks about the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is one of the landmark civil rights legislations of 50 years ago. It was devoted to employment discrimination and talked about disparate impact. It doesn't say hateful discrimination. It doesn't say prejudice. Disparate impact is an adverse effect that occurs on the basis of, those are the underlined words, race, on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Does not mention the word prejudice, does not mention the idea of hostility or animus. Discrimination is just treating people differently, and that is enough in the context of the law to qualify as discrimination. So when I say this concerns discriminating without awareness, I'm talking about treating people differently, and generally this is treating people differently in a way that makes a difference to the advantages or disadvantages they experience. Part of this societal revolution, which includes the decline of discrimination, no longer is there the hostile, overt discrimination, the many hate crimes. There still are hate crimes, but they have diminished greatly. In addition to that, political correctness has changed greatly. And when I deliberately say political correctness has changed because we think political correctness is a recent development. Well, the phrase political correctness is a recent development, but people behaved politically correctly early in the 20th century also. And at that time, political correctness pretty much demanded that you be willing to say that you discriminated against groups and to act in discriminatory fashion. That was then politically correct. French have a saying, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, means the more things change, the more they stay the same. And asking that question, or saying this phrase with a question mark after it, indicates a concern that many scholars have as to whether this change in societal discrimination amounts to a genuine change in the way things are operating below the surface or only a superficial change. That's a central question to the line of work I'm doing. The second revolution is a scientific revolution that I date as approximately starting 30 years ago, and it's clearly still in progress. I can say that because I'm glad to be part of it, and I can see that there are jobs that this revolution is engaged in right now that are not completed. I am trying to work towards completion as the ones that I recognize, the jobs that I recognize as being among the most important. But included in this discrimination is a new understanding of discrimination. I call this part of an implicit revolution. You may not have heard that phrase, which would be totally understandable because I'm one of the few people using it. I will be trying to promote it. The essence of this revolution is that our minds operate at two levels, but we are aware of only one of the two levels. Very informally, we can call these two levels higher and lower. These are not psychological technical terms, and I'm going to be largely avoiding the psychological technical terms. Psychological scientists use various pairs of terms in mostly informal fashion to characterize the difference between the two levels, and those terms will do for us to get an initial understanding of them. But let's say there's a higher level and a lower level. The higher level is the one that operates rationally. The lower level operates intuitively. The higher level, we do things deliberately. The lower level, we operate automatically. If you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, he distinguishes these two levels by talking about thinking slow and thinking fast. I think actually that's the title of his book. And there are older terms that correspond to these two levels, the terms conscious and unconscious, which nowadays we understand quite a bit differently from the way Freud understood those terms. And we use the terms explicit and implicit. Implicit gets the ring around it here because this is, I'm calling this the implicit revolution in part because this term has actually done a lot to take the place of the word unconscious in modern psychological literature, and it is gradually creeping into public usage, which I guess I should be delighted about that, given that I'm one of the people trying to push this. I want to illustrate the two levels for you, and I'm going to use a visual illusion. So I'll start by asking you the question, are the two shades of gray in squares A and B, are they identical? And I can tell you immediately, this is not a trick question. And so you can probably answer this question. And, at least you can tell me if you think they look identical. Do they? Yes. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you that question again, and I'll tell you now that the next time I ask you that question, the answer is still yes. Okay. Are the two shades of gray in squares A and B identical? What's the answer? You should all be saying yes. I just told you that was the correct answer. Now, those are the two squares I showed you. Those are the two I've showed you next. Those are exactly the same shades of gray. Pretty hard to believe, but they are. And so I'm going to try to prove that to you because you probably don't even begin to believe that it's true. But I've got two ways of doing this. The first is sort of cute, but it's not as convincing as the second. So I just copy them and slide them out, and you see when I get them out of their background, they do look the same. And I'll just do that once again. You can see how the lower one is sort of changing shades as it goes through the checkerboard squares. But you think that's some sleight of hand or PowerPoint. You probably don't believe that either. But this is an illusion developed by a psychologist named Edward Adelson, whose name is down at the bottom. It's caused by context, and we can see that this is an illusion caused by context if we just remove the context, which fortunately is not at all difficult to do. So I'm going to do that quickly now. Watch squares A and B as I do this. Do they look the same now? Okay, I'll do that a little more slowly. And as I do this more slowly, watch how B, square B, is getting darker each time I remove a piece of the context. So it looks sort of halfway dark now, most of the way there. And now it looks the same. And I assure you, I didn't change the A and B. They're identical in that photo and in this one. Exactly the same gray on the screen. If you could look at the pixels one by one, you'd see that. How does this illusion happen? By the way, I hope you do believe that, because I assure you I don't have the programming skills to make those things change in those illusions. There are two important points about how this illusion happens. One, when you experience the illusion, you have no idea how it's happening. You have no idea what it is that your brain is doing to generate that illusion. Even more important, you are totally unaware that it is happening. You can only be aware if I do the various things I have done to sort of force you to recognize that it's an illusion. This gives us the essence of the implicit revolution. And, okay, this is a little bit lengthy, so bear with me. The conscious, which is the rational, the deliberate higher level of mind, works with what it receives from the unconscious, the automatic, the implicit, lower level, and that's how the lower level controls conscious experience. And on the basis of our conscious experience, we make many decisions, such as whether the two gray squares are the same. And the context that I provide for that square B makes a difference in how your conscious mind perceives it. And the effect of that context, which you can't recognize or know that it's occurring unless it's deconstructed for you, is the lower level at operation, providing something that you see consciously. What have we learned so far? The essence of the implicit revolution. Here's just a shorter version of that last statement. The higher level of mind is obliged to use what the lower level provides, using it as the basis for deliberate judgment and action. Okay, we're now at last at the main topic, which is implicit biases. What are they? I'm going to use a definition that I like that comes from an article authored by Jerry Kong, who's the second speaker in tonight's series. This is the definition in his article. And by the way, you see that is a recent article, 2012, and Jerry's name at the bottom is followed by an et al. I am one of the owls with that, but I can tell you, knowing very well that this article is a tour de force by Jerry, I got a chance to comment on it. That definition brings us to the implicit association test, which has been a method achievement that I'm very proud of, about 20 years old now, published 17 years ago, and now being presented on the internet by Project Implicit. And let me see if I can find the Project Implicit website, which is here. If you, I had a link on that slide at the bottom. If you can find this later, implicit.harvard.edu, that's how you can get to that. If you just type into any search engine implicit association test, it'll get you there also. If you get to this page, which is Project Implicit's front page, you'll notice the subliminal ad in the upper right corner for a book of which I am co-author. But you press this word go in the lower left, and takes you to this page, and I take my word for it. You can just go right down to the bottom of that page and press I wish to proceed. And then you come on a list of 14 variations of the implicit association test, some of which you may have heard of. The best known of them is the race IAT, and these are in random order. It'd be a different order every time you get there. The weapons IAT is actually a race-related one. It shows a stereotypic association of weapons with black more than white race. But there's a race IAT here somewhere. There it is, third from the bottom. A weight one. I think the two most popular are the race IAT and the gender career IAT, which is the second one from the top. If you're going to try just one or two, those are good ones to try. I'm not going to take one here, but I'm going to give you another chance to have your own interactive opportunity to perform at an implicit association test that measures a stereotype. And this one measures a stereotype that associates male and female, or tests the association of male and female gender with the concept of leadership. Any IAT is done with 4 categories, and the 4 categories in this IAT are the categories female and male, which you see in green on the outside, and the categories leader and helper. And we are trying to determine whether leader is more associated with male or female in administering this IAT. Each of these 4 categories has several stimulus items. It's usually used somewhere between 4 and 6. These are generally stimuli that are easy to categorize into their categories. So female and male are particularly easy. These are just first names that everyone can classify in the same way. And the words for leader and helper, these are not things that you have practice every day classifying, but they're not too difficult to classify. I'm going to give you some practice. Here's what I'll need you to do. I'll need you to say the words left and right. When you say those words, you are emulating the process of responding on a computer keyboard by tapping a key with either your left hand or your right hand. I will need everyone to participate. You people are sitting close enough to each other, so if you're sitting next to someone who is being silent, you're probably within elbow's reach of them, which should be the signal that they should be speaking up. Loudness is important because I need to hear you. I'm going to be pressing these keys, trying to track the speed of the median response in the group. This is, as you can imagine, a cognitively very challenging task, which I do by unknown methods. I request you to try to go fast, and there may be some errors. Just ignore them. You don't have to correct errors. Just keep going. So I'm going to start the IAT now. Let's see if it's ready to go. I think it is. Okay, so don't wait for others to respond. Don't stop for errors. Don't correct errors. I want to hear everyone's voice. We'll do a few series of what we call trials, which are presentations of items for you to respond to. And this will be practice, but I still want you to try to be going fast and speaking out loud. And remember the possible need for the use of the elbow. Okay, so left, say left if you see a female name, right if you see a male name. I'm going to start with you, but then I'm going to drop out, and then I'm just going to be pressing the keys here to track your responding. Okay, here we go. Right, left, right. Okay, that's great. I mean, you could hear, some of you are probably capable of going a little faster, but you're sort of going in unison, and there is a group sense of how difficult this is. Next task is leader and helper. So you'll see those leader and helper words. The leader words, you should say left to. The helper words, say right. I will start with you again, then I'll drop out. Right, left, right. Okay, again, good. Okay, now all we're going to do is combine those two tasks. So now we get all four categories, and we'll do this twice, and so you'll get some practice, but I do want you to try to go fast. So left, again, just for leader and for female, right for helper and male. Here we go. Left, right. Okay, we lost about 250 milliseconds or so. Only a quarter of a second. Of course, in these kinds of experiments, a quarter of a second is almost an eternity. Cognitive psychologists are used to publishing results from experiments like this that amount to effects of 10 or 20 milliseconds. So, but we'll try that again. So we're just doing exactly the same thing again. Left for leader or female, right for helper or male. Here we go. Right. Left. Okay, you got better. This is a very sharp group. I actually, it's still difficult, but this improvement is more than I expected. Maybe you people have less stereotype discrimination than I expect, but we still have a ways to go. Now, without any further practice, we're just switching the sides of male and female. So now male is on the left, female is on the right. We're going to do this with no practice. You might think that will make it difficult. Let's see what happens. Left for leader or male. Right. Okay, I'm not going to bother doing this once again. You'll probably get a little better again, but the fact that this task was immediately more easy, we didn't hear nearly as many, in addition to the lefts and the rights, there are some refts and lights. So that's probably obvious to all of us, and that second task is easier. Let me get out of here and back to this. I just want to say something about what is demonstrated by that. When you're going faster in one of those two tasks than the other, that means the associations being used in the task in which you are going faster are easier for you, meaning it is easier for you to give the same response to two sets of terms that fall into categories that are associated than two sets of terms that fall into categories that are not so well associated. So this gender leader stereotype IAT typically shows that, and this is not one of the ones you'll find on the Project Implicit website, by the way, it's used some in research, but this typically shows that there's a stronger association of male gender with leader than of female gender with leader. Okay, so why the checkerboard again? And why am I showing this with a black and a white face in squares A and B? And the answer to that question is I'm actually not showing you a black and white face. Those are actually two faces that are morphed halfway between black and white. But when they're in those backgrounds, so you see one darker and the other one lighter, you're more likely to think it's black. But I'm not so much interested in that as to try to get you to begin the task of making an analogy between the checkerboard illusion and the kinds of social effects that I'm interested in and that we study in research on implicit biases and implicit stereotypes. So here's the analogy I want you to think about. Just as the conscious mind perceives a checkerboard square via implicit processes controlled by visual context, and I mean perceives the shade of gray of that square, so also the conscious mind perceives and judges a person via implicit processes that are controlled by demographic context. So we've gone from visual context to demographic context, and I best try to explain what I mean by demographic context. When we see a person, a face, we immediately are able to classify that person as, in terms of demographic characteristics, at least race, age, sex, probably ethnicity, possibly weight, possibly social status, possibly level of education, possibly occupation. A lot of things jump out immediately. These are all demographic categories, the kinds of questions you answer when you fill out the census or many surveys. Those things are perceived so rapidly that if you look at a person for just a half second, a total stranger, close your eyes, and then try to answer the questions, was it male or female, was it young or old, white or black, American, foreign, rich, poor, intelligent, unintelligent. You can ask some of those questions even though some of them are not given as automatically by visual context as others. That's an automatic process happening. You get the demographic information immediately, just as you get the checkerboard square context immediately in the visual illusion. This process of getting the demographic context affects conscious judgments about the person who provides those cues, who's the source of those demographic cues. This type of effect is just as powerful and operates just as much outside awareness as does the checkerboard illusion. So again, back to the mantra I gave you about what it is that the implicit revolution is about. The higher level of mind is obliged to use what the lower level provides as the basis for deliberate judgment and action. When you are perceiving a person's demographics, those categories, they are producing automatic effects at the lower level that feed into the conscious impression you have of that person which you then will use as the basis for judgments and decisions you're making that could affect that person. Okay, back to my roadmap. My point is, an important part of my point is that discrimination can occur without intent to discriminate and without awareness of discriminating. How does this occur? Let me give you quickly 4 ways. I've got to keep track of my time because they'll kick me off the stage before I'm finished if I don't. Here are the 4 ways: institutional discrimination, accumulating advantage and disadvantage, in-group favoritism, implicit bias. I'm just going to say a few words, try to get through each of these briefly, and then go on to the conclusions I'm trying to get to. Institutional discrimination. I heard this NPR story almost a year ago about charges given to criminal defendants, prisoners, and others who were indigent, and charges, financial charges to these people that they had to pay in order to be processed by the court system or the penal system. In more than 40 states, the states can legally assess payments from court defendants for public defenders, prisoners for room and board in jail and prison. They can assess released prisoners for supervision on parole and probation, and those on bail or probation can be assessed also for electronic monitoring devices they're obliged to wear. These are often people with no ability to pay. They are then charged interest on the fines that they cannot pay. They can then be sent to jail for non-payment of accumulated debt. So notice, I wasn't aware of this until I heard this story on NPR a year ago. Then I discovered that some excellent research on it is being done by Alexis Harris and some colleagues in the sociology department at University of Washington. That work was referred to in the NPR story. But this is a way in which people in jail or processed by the courts on some relatively minor offense, perhaps, are charged amounts they can't pay, and then they can get a more serious jail time for not paying those debts and the accumulating interest. Well, accumulating advantage and disadvantage is in part what that was about, and these 4 categories I'm talking about are not totally separate from each other, and I'm not going to worry about that. I think it's useful to distinguish them nevertheless. Next one I'm talking about is this accumulating advantage and disadvantage is something that sociologist Robert Merton wrote about in a 1968 article published in Science, which he called the Matthew effect, and he was basing that on a biblical quote from the book of Matthew. "Unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." Now that actually sounds partly like a description of the situation with the prison fines of indigents that I just described, but there are a lot more things that fall into that category. And in the talk that follows this one, Jerry Kong, I know he's going to include some striking illustrations of these accumulating advantages and disadvantages. In-group favoritism. We have a little diversion now. Let's hope the sound is good.
A lot of people talk about racial prejudice, and some people have gone so far as to say that there are actually 2 Americas, one black and one white. But talk is cheap. So I decided to look into the problem myself, firsthand, to go underground and actually experience America as a white man. I hired the best makeup people in the business.
What are you doing?
I'm buying this newspaper.
That's all right. There's nobody around. Go ahead, take it. Take it. Go ahead, take it. Yeah, take it. Take it.
Slowly I began to realize that when white people are alone, they give things to each other for free.
Now, let me get this straight, Mr. White. You'd like to borrow $50,000 from our bank, but you have no collateral. You have no credit. You don't even have any ID. Is that correct?
That's right.
Mr. White, I'm sorry. This is not a charity. This is a business.
Harry, why don't you take your break now? I'll take care of Mr. White.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Bob.
That was a close one, wasn't it? We don't have to bother with these formalities, do we, Mr. White, huh? Just take what you want, Mr. White. Pay us back any time, or don't. We don't care.
So this is what Eddie Murphy said in the middle of that, which this is, you may recognize this as a shortened clip of a routine he did or film they made on Saturday Night Live about 30 years ago. Slowly, I began to realize that when white people are alone, they give things to each other for free. Notice the heading, in-group favoritism. Now, this may seem like ridiculous satire, totally unconnected with reality, but I want you to think further about it. In-group favoritism is a very familiar term. I think it is useful to use another term that's almost the same thing, practically. A synonym that I refer to as selective benevolence, meaning more benevolent to some than others. Think about these situations and ask, are these situations in which, in effect, very often white people or predominantly white people are giving things to other white people, or at least to predominantly other white people, for free? In recruiting for jobs, when the mainly white employees of a company are asked to help bring in others for new management or high-level positions, and of course they know mostly other white people, they're going to recommend other white people. Work performance evaluations, when a white manager is evaluating a white supervisor and the evaluation is sort of on the borderline between meets expectations and exceeds expectations, well, maybe the benefit of the doubt is going to go more to the white person and get that exceeds expectations than meets expectations, and that may be selective benevolence. Houses, these are all areas in which we know from data that discrimination occurs, that the outcomes to blacks are less favorable than to whites, and very well done experiments, audit experiments done in real estate. Are the realtors doing a favor for white potential buyers and renters by showing them apartments that they decline to show to others? Bank loan rates, well, the banks may not be giving away money as in that Eddie Murray skit. On the other hand, maybe they are, but they don't tell us about it. But we do know that actually interest loan rates to whites on average are lower than equally qualified blacks. That's another result of the audit experiments. Healthcare disparities. This again isn't exactly giving something for free, but how do people get into the higher standard care that, if approved by a physician, will be paid in full by insurance versus the standard care, which costs less? Well, if they know the physician, if they are recommended to the physician by a friend of the physician, maybe just if they're white, they are more likely to get that higher quality care. That is a form of giving things free to white people, and it's not automatic white to white, but statistically it is more that than the other. Warnings after traffic stops. I don't know how many of you have been stopped for some offense, but you might ask yourself, well, did I get a ticket? Did I get a warning? What happened? Who gets the warnings? Who gets the tickets? Well, there are studies of traffic stops that show that, in fact, whites get more favorable treatment on a traffic stop. And it's not because they are more innocent. When the cars are searched, there's actually more likely, one's more likely to find contraband, meaning drugs or weapons, in cars of whites than cars of blacks who are stopped. Recently, Comey, the new FBI director, a recent FBI director, gave a speech in which I can only say that he is advertising my research. I'll play you a clip of it.
Much research points to the widespread existence of unconscious bias. Many people in our white majority culture have unconscious racial biases and react differently to a white face than a black face. In fact, we all, white and black, carry various biases around with us. A mental shortcut becomes almost irresistible and maybe even rational by some lights. The two young black men on one side of the street look like so many others that officer has locked up. Two white men on the other side of the street, even in the same clothes, do not. The officer does not make the same association about the two white guys, whether that officer is white or black. And that drives different behavior.
So there's some things that Comey said in this that will explain why I say he's advertising the research. Many people in our white majority culture have unconscious racial biases. A mental shortcut, he's talking about the lower level, becomes almost irresistible and maybe even, he's saying it seems rational. He's talking about the higher level that the shortcut affects. And he ends by saying, and the associations that are made, he does use the word association here in the next to last line over on the left side, says that drives different behavior. He's saying this makes a difference in the behavior. I couldn't have written a better script for him to advertise this research. Well, I would have had him use the word implicit once or twice, but that's about it. Now, here's some forms of discrimination. These are mostly forms of discrimination, or maybe all forms of discrimination that have been statistically demonstrated in studies. Which of these are discrimination that can occur without the people who are the mediators, the actors who allow the discrimination to happen or do the discrimination without their intention or awareness? There are disparities in healthcare that are well documented. There are police stops well documented. Voter disqualification, very strongly known to be influenced by race, and it's a matter of the discretion of the poll workers in deciding whether to let anyone vote or not. Criminal disenfranchisement, this means losing the right to vote as a consequence of being in prison or being an ex-convict. Many states, most states, disenfranchise criminals, and because we have a criminal system which is known to be biased by its laws in imprisoning more blacks, incarcerating more blacks than whites who are not actually differently behaving, such as the crack cocaine and versus powder cocaine jail, which by itself is a huge driver. School expulsions demonstrated to be greater for black students than white students when sent to the principal's office. Hiring, access to housing, tipping behavior, bail setting by judges, parole decisions by parole boards, job performance evaluations, salaries and raises in workplaces, high school graduation rates, definitely very different by race in this country. Election to political office, blacks and Hispanics, even though they are increasingly succeeding in election, are still well underrepresented relative to population, as are women. Okay. I have to move very rapidly now, and so I'll be going at top speed for the remainder. The idea of giving you the gender leader IAT was to show you that you may have things in your head that could show up on the IAT that you don't endorse. Individual differences in the race attitude IT have been shown to predict differences in race discrimination, and IAT measures also have been shown to predict consumer product choice, career preferences, substance abuse, attachment and close relationships, sexual orientation, spider and snake phobias, and political candidate choice. I've been involved in a couple of studies in the 2008 and 2012 elections that showed that Barack Obama, despite winning the presidential election in both of those years, actually got about 5% less of the popular vote than he would have in the absence of race bias. These studies are not easy to do, but there are actually several studies in addition to ones I've been involved with that show this. Okay. It's very difficult to prevent unintended discrimination, part of my point, and I'm going to virtually skip this, which I was intending to do anyway, but I do have a list I wasn't going to go through it quite that fast. I do have a list of the things one would need to change in order to change all these forms of unintended discrimination. And these, by and large, are things that individual people cannot by themselves change, and more important, they're changes that require institutional changes that are just not about to happen, that almost no one is motivated to do. We are not going to undo the social status hierarchies, at least not in any small number of decades, that produce the accumulating disadvantages and advantages. We're not going to change the mass media content. The First Amendment won't allow us to do this. And unfortunately, we don't yet know how to undo implicit biases. There nevertheless are things one can do. My final point, and I want to think about and ask you to think about, what can one person do? One, teacher. I start with a few things that I am: researcher, mid-level manager. I actually am a sort of mid-level manager, meaning that in the university as a professor, there are actually a few people beneath me that I actually have supervisory power over: PhD students, honors undergraduate students, students in my class, research assistants. Online shoppers, what can they do? This is a difficult one to answer. Neighborhood shoppers. Suppose you want to, you shop in your neighborhood, you are going to places where the people are demographically like you. You're not going to undo things by shopping in your neighborhood. Suppose you said, I want to find a place to shop in which I'll be able to give others business. Well, the Seattle.gov has a site. I'm not going to show it to you now, but you can find the Women and Minority Business Enterprise site and find, not in the best form, they won't tell you where to find the grocery store within shortest distance, but maybe if they got together with Google, they could do that. What can one hiring manager do? What can one chief diversity officer at a large hospital do, such as University of Washington Medical Center? What can the chief executive of a company that does diversity training do? These are all things that I think, these are all roles in which I think actually individual people in those roles have the opportunity to do things, and I won't have time to get into detail. How about a chief of an executive of a company known to have race, ethnic, gender disparities, such as Amazon, Microsoft, and Google recently publicized for themselves? What can one CEO of those companies do? How about a company that's not even aware because they haven't looked at the data of their company? Well, that CEO can look at the data. What can one police officer do? This is the last item in my list. And it's an important one in our local circumstances, because we all know that police departments, not only Seattle's, but all over the United States, are facing this question of what should police officers do. And this question of stops is interesting. I want to just describe quickly one instance of a stop I was told about at a symposium I was attending at Seattle University. Black woman told me she was stopped for having a traffic light, not a traffic light, a car light, a tail light out in her car. This is a standard reason for a stop. And you might expect that this was a case of driving while black. The white police officer who stopped her in this case told her she had a tail light out and offered to look in her fuse box and see if there was an easy explanation for it, and he actually fixed it. She went on her way. This is, to me, just a tremendous example of what a police officer can do. Police officers are in roles in which they are not frequently obliged by the requirements of their job to help others, but they are actually in many circumstances in which they might have the opportunity to help if either they recognize that that was one of the possibilities, or if they had in their manual some advice that this is actually something that's good to do. Is this something that Seattle's Community Police Commission should look at? I would try to tell them yes. I think firefighters are known as helpers. Police officers we have different associations to firefighters and police officers because firefighters we associate more with helping. So if we had the helper versus something IAT for firefighters and police officers, it would be a very interesting result. It's not been done yet. Okay, I'm done. I want to thank Mahzreen Banaji, Brian Nozick. These have been my two collaborators. Mahzreen's for more than 30 years. Brian since the mid-90s when he became a graduate student working with Mahzreen. Originally, we had support from NSF and NIMH. Unfortunately, in recent political times, it's become unpopular for the federal government to support this kind of research. But fortunately, a nonprofit called Project Implicit has come along and is actually supporting some of my research. And Project Implicit is the organization that runs the IAT website at which you can find IATs. So until now, Project Implicit has not solicited contributions, not trying to expand its research base, but it operates on income it earns from research clients. It hosts research by many researchers at its research site and some training it does. It's time to start getting contributions, Project Implicit. I can say that because I'm the president of Project Implicit. And then there's the book Blind Spot, which you can find easily on Amazon, and which I am co-author with Mahzreen Banaji. The royalties from this book are supporting research. And so I encourage you to support research. You could buy the book, or you could just give all the money to research. You don't have to buy the book. Thank you very much.
We'll have time for a couple. Yes, that's right. So you could sit up here. Yeah. So we'll have time for a couple of questions. If those who have questions might want to move to the.
So please come up to the microphone if you want to ask a question, so that we can get the questions
Or learn more about the
recorded.
IAT. Okay.
I'll ask you a question.
Yes.
Could you tell us, we are all different people, but if you gave us one thing to go away from today and to do to try and operationalize this research, what would you ask each of us to do?
What would I ask? Well, there's nothing
Besides
that applies
do the research,
automatically
but I mean,
to everyone. And I think
Okay.
I stated that question in terms of what your role is. And so for me, as a researcher or teacher, I actually see things I can do. I can, as a teacher, I can do evaluations of students in which I have no possibility of allowing my knowledge of their demographics to influence the judgment. Now, of course, if I know who I'm grading, I don't want to do that anyway, but it's not enough that I intend not to do it. It's more important for me to make it impossible for myself to do it. So that's just an example how, and that's obviously something that's specific to my role as a teacher evaluating students, but most of those other circumstances I described are ones in which people have opportunities for similar ways to use the situation and what power they have. In some cases, it's a lot of power. In some cases, it's a modest amount of power to do things in a way that are less prone to operation of biases and unintended discrimination.
Thank you.
So I'm curious how much of the research has been done in non-American and, in fact, non-Western cultures, and if there's any difference in some of the implicit assumptions.
Non-American is a lot because there's a good deal of this research using implicit methods in both Europe and Asia and India. So a good bit. Still, not enough in Africa and South America. So it's not quite worldwide, although if you go to the Project Implicit website, you'll find that you can take versions of the implicit association test in about 30 different languages, including some African and even more South American languages. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. However, because I'm just saying that this research has spun worldwide to the extent that we know there's a lot of similarities among industrialized groups, and there's, of course, much more research done in industrialized settings than non-industrialized settings.
Dr. Greenwald, good to see you again.
Hi, Greg.
There's research that reveals that when individuals, professionals become aware of their implicit bias, that they can choose to compensate for it. Does that indicate that the more awareness we can provide to individuals in their personal, professional environments, that it is possible that people can begin to start making some strides in that direction? I know that I've taken the IET test multiple times and my scores keep changing. I keep revealing less and less bias. Your thoughts there?
So let me decompose your question into two questions. Being mindful of implicit bias by taking the implicit bias, the IAT, and being aware that your decisions may be influenced by implicit bias. Is that good or bad? Well, I think it's good. I think it can motivate change, but I don't think it automatically produces change. That's the second part of the question. So what does it take to make the second step to go from I know about bias and hopefully other forms of unintended discrimination, not just implicit bias? And I'm trying to make the point that there are more forms of unintended discrimination. What does it take to cut those off? Is it just my intention to overcome that? And most of the evidence I have says that's not enough. Necessary to do more, and if you can find ways to make it impossible to engage in bias, such as the orchestral audition committees that started auditioning soloists behind curtains so that couldn't be told whether they were male or female, and all of a sudden the female hiring rate by orchestras jumped. That's the kind of thing that needs to be added to the good intentions.
Thank you.
We'll take these two last two questions.
Good evening. Question for you. So I know you talked a lot about discrimination and bias, but like working in the early childhood field, I see more African American, Latino children getting kicked out of preschool on a regular basis straight across the United States. So when does this bias and discrimination, does it ever turn into racism? And also I want to know, what is your when you have to define racism, what does it mean to you?
Excuse me, could you say again, when I have the what? Was that last sentence?
What does the word racism mean to you, like your meaning of it? That was the last question.
I have started avoiding the word racism. It's not that I think racism has disappeared. I'm sure it hasn't. But I don't think it's the big part of the problem. I definitely think it still is a problem, but I understand racism to be a state of mind that includes dislike and hostility, and I think so much more significant discrimination occurs in the absence of hostility that we ought to be attending more to it. But I don't at all mean to say that racism is gone and that we shouldn't be concerned about it. We should.
So I know that your research has only been going back so long, but have you seen any longitudinal studies about the difference of the lower level and like how that might be quantified? Because I know that you talked a lot about overt bias reducing over time. Is there any way to track whether implicit bias has been reducing over time?
We're in the process of discovering what we know about how implicit bias has changed over the years. So we have some tests that have been up for operating on the Project Implicit site for about 13 years, including the race attitude test. And just last year, we created an archive of all those tests going back to 2003. And it's now freely available to anyone who wants to analyze the data. Excuse me, but we are analyzing some of the data ourselves, and I know your question is, okay, is it declining? And the answer is not really. People were looking for race implicit bias to decline following Barack Obama's election in 2008. It didn't. It's still just about at the same level as we get on our tracking IAT. And this is a test that is taken almost 400,000 or 500,000 times a year. So we got lots and lots of data from very different demographic components of the American population.
Thank you, Tony.